It's strange, the way silence can feel louder than any argument. I remember standing there in the crisp mountain air, snow still fresh on the steps of the porch, holding a brass key between my fingers. The metal was cold against my skin, but it felt good, solid, earned. Behind me, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the fireplace flickered in its steady rhythm. It smelled faintly of cedar and new beginnings. That's when my phone buzzed, lighting up with the familiar chaos of the family group chat. I didn't have to open it. I already knew what it would say. "Merry Christmas, everyone. Dinner starts at 6. Hope everyone can make it." Then, as always, my name was missing from the tagged list. For a second, I just stared at the message, not angry, just tired. There was something so predictable about it, the way they could forget every single year and still act surprised when I didn't show up. The years had taught me that some people don't forget by accident. They forget because it's convenient. Still, I smiled. Not the forced smile I used to give when trying to fit in, but the kind that comes when you finally realize you don't need anyone's permission to be at peace. I turned the key and stepped inside. The place was quiet, except for the crackle of the fire and the slow ticking of the clock I'd hung on the stone wall the night before. This house wasn't just wood and glass. It was proof. Proof that sometimes, the best way to answer being left out is to build something that can't be taken away. I had dreamed of this view for years, the mountains stretching endlessly beneath the sky, the world below too small to hear the noise I'd walked away from. As I hung my coat, another message came in. A photo of the family around the same old table, everyone smiling like the past never happened. The same table where my chair used to be. The same one where my name used to be written on a place card, until it was. I watched the picture for a while, the flickering lights reflecting off the phone's screen. For once, it didn't hurt. Maybe because I finally understood something simple and true. Being excluded does mean you're unworthy. Sometimes it means you've outgrown the room. I set the phone down and picked up the small wooden box from the counter. Inside were my new house keys, 3 of them, identical, gleaming under the kitchen light. I'd planned to give one to someone special, maybe a friend, maybe even an estranged cousin if they ever tried to make things right. But for now, they stayed with me. After all these years of waiting for someone to give me a key to belong, I'd finally given one to myself. The house creaked softly as the wind passed through the pines outside. It wasn't loneliness I felt, it was peace. A quiet kind of victory that didn't need to be announced or posted or proved. I made myself a cup of tea, walked to the window and watched the lights in the valley below. Somewhere down there, they were gathering again, probably laughing, probably toasting to another perfect family Christmas. And maybe it was perfect for them. For me, perfection looked like this, standing in a warm house I built, not to prove them wrong, but to prove myself right. I raised the mug toward the glass, a small, private toast to the person I used to be, the one who waited for an invitation that would never come. "Funny," I whispered, more to the mountains than to anyone else, "how they remember my name when it's on a deed." The fire popped, almost in agreement. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel left out. I felt exactly where I was meant to be. It started long before the mountain house, before the deed and the quiet confidence that came with it. Back then, I still believed in the idea of family first. I believed that love could outweigh patterns, that good intentions were enough to erase years of being overlooked. But every December, reality came knocking like clockwork, and I was reminded that some invitations never really get lost. They just get withheld. The first time it happened, I brushed it off. I was in my early 20s, just starting a new job, juggling bills and trying to find my footing. My mother's sister sent the family message as usual, cheerful and scattered. "Everyone, confirmed for Christmas Eve, can't wait to see all my favorite people." I assumed I'd get my own follow-up text later. It never came. When I mentioned it, she laughed and said, "Oh honey, we thought you'd be too busy this year." I was. I was sitting in my tiny apartment that night, eating Chinese takeout and watching old holiday movies, convincing myself it was just a misunderstanding. The second year, I noticed the pattern. They had a group chat when I wasn't in. My cousin accidentally showed me her phone when she was scrolling through photos. I saw my own name missing from the thread where they'd planned dinner, gifts, the theme. "We're keeping it small this time," they'd said when I asked. But small included cousins, boyfriends, new girlfriends, and even a neighbor's kid. Apparently, small didn't mean few, it just meant not me. Still, I kept trying. I sent Christmas cards. I called my aunt, asked what I could bring. I'd get vague answers. Oh, don't worry about it. Or, we're still figuring things out. Every year, the same dance. The same polite distance wrapped in festive excuses. People say exclusion is subtle, but it's not. You feel it in your chest like static before a storm. You start to read between every word, noticing how silence can fill a room faster than noise ever could. I remember scrolling through social media that third year, seeing the matching sweaters, the posed laughter. I knew the house, the tree, the same table where my chair once sat. They hadn't forgotten me. They'd erased me with a smile. At some point, the sadness turned into study. I began to collect the evidence, not out of spite, but to keep myself from gaslighting my own memories. Screenshots of texts, call logs, even the little scene icon on a message I'd sent asking, "Should I bring dessert?" and never getting a reply. Each year added a new layer of proof, a breadcrumb trail of polite rejection. I tucked them away in a folder on my laptop labeled Holiday Notes. It sounds small, maybe even petty, but when people insist that your pain isn't real, proof becomes a form of sanity. Funny thing, when you stop asking for an invitation, people start to wonder why you're quiet. The year I didn't call or text first, I got a message on Christmas morning. "We missed you last night. You should have reminded us you wanted to come." As if belonging required begging. That was the moment I realized the truth. Some families only love you when you fit their idea of convenient. I don't tell this part of the story to earn sympathy. I share it because I know I'm not the only one who's been forgotten in plain sight. So if you're listening to this and thinking, "Yeah, that's happened to me too," maybe take this as your sign to stop waiting for people who only remember you when it serves them. You don't need their table to have a good meal, and you don't need their roof to feel at home. That's what I eventually learned. The absence of their invitation was never really about me. It was about control. Keeping me on the edge of belonging gave them power. But power only works when you let it. The day I stopped chasing their approval was the day I started building something of my own. And I guess that's why this year, when they forgot again, it didn't sting the way it used to, because I wasn't waiting anymore. I'd already found my place, when I built key by key, wall by wall. Every family has two versions, the one they show the world and the one that exists behind closed doors. Ours was no different. On the surface, we were the kind of family that looked picture perfect, the kind that sent out glossy holiday cards every year, all dressed in coordinated colors, framed smiles frozen just right. To anyone scrolling past, we looked close, wholesome, unbreakable. But under all that shine was a quiet hierarchy, an unspoken pecking order that never had room for me. They liked to talk about togetherness, about how family was everything. But if you listened closely, you'd hear the rules tucked beneath the words. The oldest cousin made the plans, the aunt approved them, and everyone else just fell in line. I learned early on that my role was to stay agreeable, to keep my voice soft, my needs small, and my presence unproblematic. When you grow up on the outside edge of a family circle, you learn to make yourself smaller just to fit into the picture. It wasn't always obvious. They didn't raise their voices or slam doors. Their brand of exclusion was polished, polite, even. A "we forgot" here, a "maybe next time" there, and yet every omission left a mark. I'd watch from afar as photos appeared online, those long dinner tables lined with laughter, and my name never once mentioned in the comments or captions. It wasn't that they didn't know where I was, it's that they didn't see why I should be there. There's one memory I can't shake. It was 2 winters ago, the kind of December that felt colder than usual. I stopped by my aunt's house unannounced, arms full of gifts I'd picked out for the kids, things I'd wrapped myself, each tagged with names written in silver ink. When she opened the door, surprise flickered across her face before she managed to hide it behind a smile. "Oh, we weren't expecting you," she said, glancing behind her like she needed approval from someone inside. In that split second, I realized something. I was always unexpected, even in a family that claimed I belonged. Inside, everything was set: food on the table, stockings hung, music low and warm. My coat stayed on the whole time. They offered me pie, polite small talk, but not a chair. There wasn't one left, so I stood there holding my plate, pretending it didn't matter. And maybe it didn't then, but it left a quiet bruise I didn't admit to anyone. Later that night, I sat in my car under the yellow glow of the street lamp, the wrapped gifts still in the passenger seat. I thought about dropping them off anyway, but something in me said, no more trying to earn space that should have been freely given. That was the night I stopped mistaking silence for peace. Sometimes peace is simply the pause before you reclaim yourself. It's funny, though, how the world still believed in our togetherness. Strangers, old classmates, even distant relatives would comment, "Your family seems so close, you're lucky." I never corrected them. I just smiled, the same way my family smiled for photos wide enough to hide the truth. The image worked. The illusion always does. I remember once overhearing a relative say, "She's just sensitive," when I didn't show up to a gathering they never told me about. Sensitive. It stuck with me, that word. It's what people call you when they don't want to admit they've hurt you. But sensitivity isn't weakness, it's awareness. It's seeing what others pretend not to. And maybe that's what changed in me over the years. I stopped pretending. I started noticing the cracks in the family portrait, the way laughter sometimes sounded rehearsed, how affection always came with conditions. It was liberating in a way, realizing that I didn't need to keep knocking on a door that only opened when it made them look good. The thing about always being the one without a key is that eventually you start dreaming of your own lock, your own door, your own place where you decide who gets to walk in. That thought began to grow quietly inside me, a seed planted in every ignored text, every forgotten invite, every time I watched them clink glasses without me. I didn't know it then, but that seed was already taking root. And one day it would grow into the foundation of something they'd never expect, a mountain house with my name on the deed, and keys that finally fully belonged to me. The shift didn't happen in one grand moment. It crept in quietly, like dawn seeping through a half-closed curtain. For years I'd been circling the same loop, hopping, waiting, forgiving, pretending. Then, one morning, I woke up and felt something in me unclench. It wasn't anger, it was clarity, a kind of calm I hadn't known I'd been missing. The world hadn't changed, my family hadn't apologized or even noticed, but I had, and that was enough to start something new. It began with work. A project I'd poured myself into finally paid off. Months of long nights and second-guessing turned into a promotion I hadn't even dared to expect. Suddenly, the numbers in my account looked different. For the first time, stability didn't feel like a daydream. I remember staring at the deposit notification, whispering, "So this is what security feels like." It wasn't about the money itself. It was about what it represented: choice. I could finally make choices that didn't depend on anyone's approval or invitation. Around that same time, an unexpected letter arrived in the mail. It was from an old mentor, a retired teacher who had always believed in me long before I believed in myself. I hadn't heard from her in months, but inside the envelope was a short note written in her delicate handwriting. "You've spent your life opening doors for others. Maybe it's time you walk through one meant for you." Attached was a modest inheritance she'd arranged before moving into assisted living. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to start something tangible. I remember holding that check and feeling the weight of it, not in value, but in validation. Someone saw me. Someone trusted me. It felt like the universe's quiet nod, telling me to stop waiting for acceptance in places that had never offered it freely. At first, I didn't even know what to do with the money. I toyed with the idea of travel, maybe a small investment, or even a down payment on an apartment in the city. But the thought of another small box of a life, surrounded by neighbors, noise, and no real space to breathe, didn't appeal to me anymore. I wanted something still, something far, something mine. That's when I saw the listing. It wasn't much to look at, a slightly weathered cabin perched on a mountainside about 2 hours from the city. The photos were grainy, the description brief. Needs work, great views, secluded. For some reason, I couldn't stop looking at it. The realtor probably thought I was crazy when I called that same afternoon, but there was a kind of pull I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the word secluded. Maybe it was the view of the valley that reminded me what perspective really looked like. When I drove up to see it, snow was melting in uneven patches along the road, the kind that made the air smell clean and alive. The cabin sat there quietly, a little worn but proud. It had big windows that caught the last of the daylight, and as I stood there, I could almost see what it could become. It wasn't perfect, but neither was I. Maybe that's why it felt right. I ran my hand along the wooden railing of the porch and felt the roughness of time carved into it. It reminded me of myself, weathered but still standing. That's when the realtor handed me the key. It was small, brass, unremarkable. And yet, when I turned it in the lock for the first time, something inside me shifted. I didn't know then that this single motion, this tiny, simple click, would echo back at me years later like a line drawn between two versions of my life. The one where I waited to be chosen, and the one where I chose myself. Standing in that empty space, surrounded by nothing but echoes and dust, I felt an odd mix of peace and disbelief. No one had given me permission to be there. No one had to. It was mine, all mine. The walls creaked softly as if they were breathing with me. I whispered, "We'll make this work," like a promise to both of us. That night, driving back down the mountain, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, tired eyes, a small smile. The headlights traced the road ahead, winding and uncertain, but steady. I didn't know it yet, but those keys in my pocket weren't just for a house. They were for an entirely new way of living. And as the mountain faded behind me, I realized something simple but profound. I wasn't chasing an invitation anymore. I was building a place where I would never again need to ask for one. She lived 2 cabins down the winding road, an older woman named Margaret, though she insisted I call her Mags. The kind of person who didn't talk much but somehow seemed to already know everything worth saying. The first time we met, I was hauling boxes from my car to the porch, trying not to slip on the patchy ice, when her voice drifted across the snow. "That hill bites if you're not careful." She stood there in her wool coat and bright red scarf, holding a tin of cookies that looked homemade, even though she swore later they were. She had that familiar kind of warmth, the sort that makes you forget how cold it is outside. Her eyes, pale blue and quick, scanned me the way someone reads a story they already understand the ending to. "I figured you might need something sweet for the first night," she said. "Moving alone is no small thing." That line stayed with me, moving alone. She didn't say living alone or being alone, just moving like it was an act of motion, of becoming, not isolation. I smiled and thanked her, but I didn't tell her much. At least not then. Over the next few weeks, she'd wave from her porch when I came home, or stop by with coffee when she knew I was working on repairs. She had lived in the area her whole life and knew every creak of these old cabins. She showed me how to seal the windows against the winter wind, how to keep the pipes from freezing, even where to find the best hardware store in town. In the quiet of those snowy afternoons, with the smell of pine and sawdust mixing in the air, I found myself talking to her more than I expected to. One evening, as we sat by my fire sipping tea, I told her carefully, almost shyly, about my family. How they forgot to invite me, how I used to wait for a call that never came. I said it lightly, the way you do when you've told a painful story too many times, trying to make it sound like it doesn't matter anymore. But Mags didn't fill the silence with pity or easy sympathy. She just nodded slowly, the firelight flickering across her lined face. "They didn't forget you," she said finally. "They just got used to you not expecting better." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit harder than any speech could. She leaned back in her chair, eyes on the fire. "I had a sister who used to do that," she added. "Wouldn't tell me about gatherings till the day after. Eventually, I realized it wasn't about me not being good enough. It was about her needing to feel like she was." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The truth in her words stung, but in a cleansing kind of way. Like rubbing alcohol on an old wound, it hurt, but it healed. She smiled then, soft but steady. "You're here now. You've got your own place, your own key. That's not running away. That's building your own table." Her phrase stuck with me for days afterward. Build your own table. It rolled around in my head like a mantra, showing up when I least expected it. When I was sanding the porch railing, when I fixed the fireplace grate, when I hung the curtains she'd helped me measure. Every nail, every repaired corner, every light bulb changed felt like another piece of that table she'd spoken about. Mags didn't ask for details after that night. She didn't need to. But every now and then, she'd drop a line that reminded me she saw more than I said. "People forget, darling, that boundaries aren't walls, they're doors with locks that only you control." Or, "Don't wait for folks to come around. Sometimes you just have to start without them. Her kind of wisdom was quiet but relentless. It seeped into the cracks of my defenses until I realized she wasn't just teaching me how to keep a cabin warm through winter. She was teaching me how to keep myself warm through life. A few weeks later, she handed me a small keychain as I was leaving her porch. It was a tiny brass key, carved with the word home. She laughed and said, "I know you've already got plenty of keys, but it never hurts to have one that reminds you why you earned them." That night, I placed it on the counter beside the real ones, the ones that opened doors I owned. It caught the light, glowing faintly in the quiet kitchen. I remember thinking how strange it was that a near stranger could understand me more than people who'd known me my whole life. For years, I'd looked for validation from people who measured my worth by convenience. And yet here, in the stillness of the mountains, an elderly neighbor offered it freely, with no agenda, no history, just truth. She didn't tell me to forgive or forget. She told me to live. And maybe that was the difference. Family told me to fit in. Mags told me to stand tall. And for the first time in a long time, I did. The first time I decided to look back through the old messages, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe closure. Maybe proof that I hadn't imagined it all. It was a quiet night in late November, the kind of night where the snow outside muffled every sound and the fire cracked just enough to keep the silence from feeling lonely. I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop open, scrolling through years of text threads and emails, each one a breadcrumb of my place, or lack of place, in my family's world. It's funny how memory can twist with time, how you start doubting your own version of things when people tell you, over and over, that you're being dramatic. So I started collecting the evidence, not to accuse, not to shame, but to anchor myself in truth. The first message I found was from 6 years ago. "We didn't realize you weren't added to the group chat. Oops, next time." I remembered that oops. I remembered how I'd laughed it off at the time, replying with a smiley face because I didn't want to make it awkward. There was another from the following year. "We thought you were visiting friends that weekend. Sorry for the mix-up." But I hadn't been. I'd been home, just invisible. As I scrolled deeper, a pattern started to form. Every year, different excuses, same result. One message from my cousin 2 years ago caught me off guard. It wasn't meant for me, it had been sent to the wrong thread. It read, "It's less awkward without them. You know how they get." I remember freezing, my breath catching just like it had the day I first saw it. Them, not me, them. Like I was a category, a problem to be avoided. I had saved that screenshot all those years ago without really knowing why. Now, as I stared at it again in the warm light of my kitchen, I realized it wasn't bitterness I felt, it was clarity. So I started saving everything, screenshots of messages, emails, calendar invites that conveniently skipped my name, even voicemail transcriptions where relatives said, "We thought you knew." Each one went into a folder labeled receipts, holidays. The name made me laugh a little. It sounded petty, but it was the kind of humor that helped you survive small heartbreaks. The more I gathered, the lighter I felt. There was something grounding about putting it all in one place, as if, by numbing the pattern, I was breaking it. No one could make me question my memory again. No one could tell me it was all in my head. At some point, I looked up and noticed how the snow had started to fall again outside the big window. The flakes glowed under the porch light, each one drifting softly toward the ground. I thought about how snow can both erase and reveal, covering everything in a perfect white layer, but leaving behind tracks for anyone willing to look closely. My receipts, in a way, were the same. They didn't exist to expose anyone. They existed to trace where I'd been. Mags stopped by the next morning for coffee, as she often did. She noticed the stack of printed pages on the counter, each neatly clipped and dated. She picked one up, read the top line, and gave me a long, knowing look. "You're not crazy," she said simply, placing the page back down. "Sometimes you just need to see it with your own eyes before you can let it go." That was exactly it. It wasn't revenge or resentment driving me, it was release. Later that day, I slipped the pages into a slim folder, labeled it in tidy handwriting, and placed it in the top drawer of my desk. I didn't need to look at it every day. I just needed to know it was there. Proof that my story existed, that my feelings had context. Before bed, I walked through the cabin, turning off the lights one by one. When I reached the front door, I caught sight of the small brass keychain Mags had given me, still hanging by the entryway. It gleamed faintly in the low light. For a moment, I thought about how strange it was, how the same hands that had once reached for invitations that never came were now holding evidence of self-worth, written in ink and time stamps. The wind rattled the windows gently, like the house was breathing around me. I touched the keychain once more and whispered to myself, "They forgot me on purpose, but I remember myself on purpose, too." And with that, I turned off the last light, knowing that sometimes closure isn't something you find in conversation. It's something you file away quietly, with your name written neatly on the front. The decision came quietly. No big revelation, no dramatic vow, just a moment that clicked in my mind like a key turning in a lock. I was standing by the window, sipping coffee as the early winter sun crept across the mountain ridge. When it hit me, I didn't need to keep waiting for something that would never change. I had proof, I had peace. Now I wanted permanence. For the first time in my life, I wanted to build something that wasn't temporary or borrowed or half-claimed. I wanted a place that had my fingerprints on the walls, my laughter in the echoes, and my name on the mailbox. That was when the idea took shape, not just to live in this mountain cabin, but to make it mine in every sense of the word. Not a hiding place, but a home. Some people mistake distance for revenge. They think that walking away means anger. But the truth is, walking away is sometimes the most peaceful act of self-respect. I didn't buy this house to prove anyone wrong. I bought it because I was done proving anything at all. Still, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a part of me that wanted them to know. Not in a look what I have now way, but in a look how fine I turned out without your approval kind of way. It wasn't vanity, it was reclamation. Mags helped me paint the front door one afternoon. I chose deep forest green because it reminded me of the pine trees that surrounded us. She laughed as she handed me a brush. "It's a power color," she said. "You'll see." She was right. Every stroke felt symbolic, like I was sealing this chapter with my own hand. Inside, I began adding pieces of my story to every room. The worn bookshelf from my first apartment, the mismatched mugs from flea markets, photos of places I'd gone alone. They didn't match, but they made sense together. They told a story of someone who'd learned to stop waiting for things to line up perfectly before taking up space. When I stood in the living room that evening, the fire glowing low and steady, I realized something. Every inch of this house reflected choice. My choice. There were no ghosts of exclusion here, no echoes of maybe next time. Just warmth, built brick by brick from my own effort. That night, I decided to host my own Christmas. Not a party, not an event, just a simple gathering. The thought made me smile, not with the intention of inviting my family, but with the idea that I could fill this space with joy that didn't depend on anyone else's permission. But before I could let go fully, I wanted to close the circle, not with confrontation, but with calm truth. I took out a blank note card and wrote, "You're welcome to visit sometime. I found a place that feels like home." I didn't say where it was. I didn't add details. I just signed it with love, real love, not the performative kind that demanded conditions. When I told Mags about it, she nodded approvingly. "That's not a revenge letter," she said. "That's a boundary with a ribbon on top." Her words made me laugh. It felt good. This quiet power, this ability to move forward without bitterness. I realized that revenge doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it looks like peace. Sometimes it sounds like laughter echoing in a home no one expected you to own. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the stars so bright they almost hummed. The mountain air was sharp, the kind that clears your thoughts whether you're ready or not. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to earn a place in rooms that were never meant to include me. And here I was now, in a place that had no door to knock on, because I'd built it myself. I picked up my phone and opened the group chat one last time. The little green bubble blinked at me, the same one that had carried years of half-hearted apologies and forgotten mentions. I typed one simple message. "I hope everyone has a wonderful Christmas this year." No bitterness, no subtext, just peace. Then, almost on impulse, I scrolled to a photo of the mountain house I'd taken that morning. The one with sunlight spilling across the porch and snow glinting off the roof. and saved it as my profile picture. Not to show off, not to explain, just to exist quietly in the same digital space where I had once been invisible. And for the first time, I didn't care whether they noticed or not. The first call came 2 days after I changed my profile picture. It was from my cousin Claire, the same one who once sent that "it's less awkward without them" message years ago. I saw her name flash on my screen, and for a brief second, my old reflexes kicked in, the polite instinct to answer quickly, to smooth things over before they became uncomfortable. But then I stopped myself. I let it ring twice, 3 times, and finally picked up with a steady, neutral hello. Her voice came through cheerful, almost too high-pitched, the way people sound when they're trying to sound casual but are really fishing for something. "Oh my gosh, so I saw your picture. That place, wow, is that where you're living now?" I smiled faintly, looking out the window at the ridge, still glazed in morning frost. "Yeah," I said simply, "it's mine." There was a pause on the other end, just a beat longer than polite conversation allows. "That's incredible," she finally said. "It looks huge. Must have taken a lot to get something like that up there." "It did," I said, not unkindly, "but it's peaceful." Another pause. Then came the part I knew was coming. "So, are you still coming down for Christmas this year?" Everyone was wondering. I had to laugh quietly. The irony was almost sweet. "I wasn't invited," I said, keeping my tone soft, almost amused. "Oh, that was a mistake," she rushed to say. "You know how group messages go. Someone must have forgotten to add your name again. I'm sure they'd love for you to come." There it was again, that little rewriting of history, the gloss over that had followed every year like clockwork. But this time I didn't bite. I wasn't angry. I just didn't play along. "I appreciate that," I said gently, "but I'm staying here this year. I'm hosting something small." A silence, a shift, and then, "Hosting? Oh, who's coming?" I smiled. Just a few friends, some neighbors, people who didn't forget to add me to things. Her laugh was nervous, brittle. She changed the subject quickly, saying she might like to visit the mountain sometime, if it's not too far. I told her she'd have to talk to my lawyer first if she wanted directions. She thought I was joking. I was. After we hung up, I sat for a moment, feeling that odd mix of sadness and satisfaction that comes when you stop explaining yourself. I didn't feel vindictive. I just felt done. Done being the forgotten one, the polite afterthought. Later that afternoon, I stopped by town to meet with my attorney, a kind older man named Harris who'd helped me handle the closing paperwork for the house. He'd become a sort of mentor, a quiet, practical ally who believed in documentation as an art form. When I told him about the call from Claire, he smiled knowingly. "People always circle back when you stop orbiting them," he said, shuffling through a file. "But I take it you're not interested in relitigation of old holidays." "Not even a little," I replied, "just making sure everything about this place stays secure." He nodded approvingly. "Good instinct. I filed the title transfer under your name only. Deed, utilities, taxes, all locked tight. No one can claim this but you." I didn't realize how much tension I'd been carrying until that moment. Hearing it, hearing the word only, felt like a receipt in itself, a lawful one. Before I left, he handed me a slim envelope. "Something for your records," he said. Inside was a notarized letter confirming my full ownership and property rights. It was simple, stamped, official. Proof, once again, that I existed in ink and record, not just in memory. Driving back up the mountain, I thought about that envelope resting on the passenger seat. It wasn't about money or status. It was about acknowledgement, something my family had never given freely, but the world had quietly granted me through paperwork and persistence. When I reached the cabin, the late afternoon sun was spilling through the windows, catching on the brass keychain by the door. The same keychain that had started this whole turn inward, the symbol of being remembered, of belonging somewhere. I pinned the notarized letter on the corkboard above my desk, next to a photo of my father and me when I was small. He wasn't part of the forgetting. He passed too early for that, but he had taught me something that now rang true. When people don't invite you, it's not your cue to beg, it's your cue to build. That night, I sat by the fire with a cup of tea, flipping through the folder of old receipts one last time. I didn't feel the same sting I once did. The screenshots, the messages, they looked small now, like relics from another version of me. I took a deep breath, slid the folder into the bottom drawer, and replaced it with the notarized letter from Harris. Old proof traded for new proof. Pain replaced with peace. Somewhere in the valley below, lights from the town flickered faintly through the trees. I wondered if any of my relatives would think to drive up this way, curious about where I'd gone. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. Either way, they'd never forget me again, because forgetting someone who finally chose themselves isn't possible. The invitation came almost like a joke at first, a glossy digital card sent to my email with snowflakes twinkling around gold script that read, Family Christmas 2025. Home is where the heart is. I actually laughed when I saw it. After all these years of being accidentally left off the list, they suddenly remembered me, and with a slogan that sounded like a Hallmark apology. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and part of me wanted to see how they'd react to the version of me they'd written out of their story. I didn't respond right away. I let the message sit there, unread on their end, for a week. Then, a few days before Christmas, I replied with a simple line, "I'll see if I can make it." Nothing more. No promise, no explanation. Just enough to leave the door open because this time I would decide what showing up meant. The morning of Christmas Eve, I drove down the winding mountain road, the sky pale and bruised with snow clouds. I wasn't planning to stay. I just wanted to make one final appearance, not for validation, but for clarity. There's a difference between closure and revenge. Closure is quiet, measured, and undeniable. It doesn't shout. It simply stands in truth. When I pulled into the driveway of my sister's house, the official host this year, the scene was almost cinematic. White lights wound around the porch columns, laughter floated from the windows, and the smell of roasted turkey drifted through the air. Everything looked perfect, like a picture they could post online with captions about family togetherness. I stood outside for a long moment before going in, just watching the silhouettes move inside, people who had spent years talking around me, now pretending to welcome me back into a space that never made room for me in the first place. Then I took a deep breath, fixed a calm smile, and walked in. The conversation faltered as soon as I entered. Not dramatically, just that subtle shift, the one where everyone suddenly becomes aware of their own words. My mother looked up from the kitchen, surprised but trying to mask it. "Oh, you came," she said, too brightly. "I did," I said softly. "I figured since everyone remembered me this year, I should at least say hello." There was an awkward chuckle, a few murmurs of course, and "we missed you." I didn't reply. I simply placed a small wrapped box on the entryway table. "That's for everyone," I said. It wasn't a gift, not really. Inside that box was a stack of small, printed envelopes, one for each family member. They didn't know it yet, but this was the moment I'd been quietly preparing for all season. My version of accountability. Dinner started in that typical way, polite conversation, too much food, and forced laughter that echoed off the walls. They asked about my new place, eyes flicking with curiosity and calculation. "It must be nice up there," my brother-in-law said. "Pretty expensive land, I hear." I smiled. "It is. I was lucky. The property used to belong to a retired judge. He sold it to me directly." That made a few forks pause midair. My father's old friend, Uncle Paul, cleared his throat. "A judge, you said?" "Yes," I said. "He actually helped me with some of the paperwork himself before he moved to Florida. Small world, right?" It was small talk on the surface, but there was a subtle shift in tone, because they could all tell there was more behind my calm answers than I was saying. After dessert, I stood up and quietly tapped my glass with a spoon. The sound cut through the chatter, and suddenly the room fell still. "Before I go," I said, "I just wanted to share something." I gestured toward the small box by the door. "Those are for each of you, just a little note." They exchanged curious glances as they each took one. Inside every envelope was a single photograph, my mountain house, bathed in golden light with a short handwritten message. "This is home. Thank you for reminding me how much I needed to build my own. No bitterness, no accusation, just truth bound in grace. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. My mother blinked, as if trying to process the message beneath the words. My sister looked down at the photo, her expression unreadable. You bought that? Someone finally asked. I did, I said, and it's been the best decision I've ever made. There was another pause, the kind that fills the air when pretense meets reality. I could see the shift happening, the realization that I hadn't come back to be included, but to show that I didn't need inclusion to feel whole anymore. When I turned to leave, I felt surprisingly light. No anger, no regret, just the quiet dignity of someone who had finally stepped out of the shadow of waiting. As I reached the door, my mother called out softly, "You'll come next year, won't you?" I turned back, meeting her eyes with a small, kind smile. "Maybe," I said, "if there's still a place for me." Then I walked out into the crisp winter air, the snow beginning to fall in soft, deliberate flakes. Behind me, the house glowed warm and bright. Ahead of me, the mountain waited, my real home, where silence wasn't a punishment but a peace I had earned. I didn't look back, not because I didn't care anymore, but because I finally understood that you can forgive people without giving them back the power to hurt you. The drive back to the mountain felt different that night, not triumphant, not heavy, just still. The kind of stillness that comes when a story finally folds in on itself. The sky had opened into a slow, gentle snowfall, and the headlights caught each flake like a spark before it disappeared into the dark. My phone buzzed a few times in the passenger seat, messages from family, no doubt, but I didn't look. I didn't need to. I already knew what they'd say. Polite confusion, half apologies wrapped in nervous humor, maybe even a few words of guilt disguised as concern. But guilt wasn't my currency anymore. By the time I reached the cabin, the snow was falling thick and slow, blanketing the roof in silence. The mountain house stood there like an old friend waiting patiently, the porch light still glowing. I parked, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a moment, watching my breath fog up the window. The weight of all those years, the forgotten invitations, the quiet ache of being almost family, it didn't feel like it was pressing down anymore. It felt like it had finally melted into something else. Understanding, maybe, or closure. Inside, the warmth hit me instantly. The fireplace had burned low, but the embers still glowed red and alive. I added a few logs, then stood there watching the flames catch, thinking about how strange it was, how easy it is to build warmth if you just give it a place to burn. My phone buzzed again. I finally picked it up. There were 12 unread messages. The first was from my mother. That was unexpected. But beautiful. We didn't realize how much we'd hurt you. Another from Claire. You really have a place like that. You look so happy. And one from my sister, short but heavy. I guess we took you for granted. I'm sorry. I read them all once, then set the phone down on the counter. No need to reply right away. Some words need to sit in silence for a while before they mean anything. Later that evening, I walked outside with a mug of hot tea and sat on the porch steps. The snow had covered the path in a soft, glowing white. In the valley below, I could see faint flickers of lights, other homes, other lives, all distant, all self-contained. I thought about the version of me who would have done anything to be seen by that family, to be remembered, to be chosen. That version had been built on hunger, the ache of wanting to belong somewhere that didn't want me back. But the person sitting here now, they didn't need proof anymore. I glanced over at the brass keychain hanging from the porch railing, the one Mags had given me months ago. The word home was still etched faintly into the metal, weathered by wind and rain. I ran my thumb over it and smiled. The motif had come full circle without me forcing it to. I was no longer the one waiting on the other side of a locked door. I had the key now to the house, to my peace, to myself. Around 9, my phone buzzed again, but this time it was Mags. I answered immediately. "So," she said, her voice warm and teasing, "how was Christmas with the ghosts of holidays past?" I laughed, the real kind of laugh from the chest. Short, civil, I left a message without saying much. That's your way of saying you handed them truth in a gift box, isn't it? Maybe, I said, but I didn't need them to feel small. I just needed to stop shrinking. Mags hummed softly on the line, her voice gentler now. You know, people remember who stood still when they should have noticed. That memory doesn't go away. I'm not sure I want them to remember out of guilt, I said quietly. I just want them to remember I existed. They will, she said, and not because you made noise, but because you made peace. We talked for a while longer about nothing and everything. The weather, the new trails she'd found, the bakery reopening in town. And as we spoke, I realized how full my life had become with people who actually showed up, who remembered, who cared. When the call ended, I sat there a while longer, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. Somewhere, deep in the woods, a branch cracked under the weight of snow, a sharp sound that echoed before fading into quiet. It reminded me that even when things break, the world keeps its rhythm. I looked out toward the dark silhouette of the mountains and took a slow breath. The snow had stopped falling, and the stars were starting to break through the clouds. The night was so clear, it felt like the whole sky was exhaling. Somewhere out there, my family was probably still talking, maybe even wondering why I'd shown up at all. But they didn't need to understand. Not this time. This wasn't about them seeing me anymore. It was about me finally seeing myself fully, without needing their reflection to feel real. Inside, the firelight danced across the walls, flickering over the framed photos and the open book on the coffee table. I walked over, set my empty mug down, and whispered softly to the room as if it could hear me. Merry Christmas, finally. And for the first time in years, I meant it not as a wish to be included, but as a declaration of peace. The morning after Christmas dawned with that kind of stillness only a mountain can hold, the world muted beneath thick snow, the air so crisp it felt almost sacred to breathe it in. I woke up without an alarm, without the usual holiday heaviness that used to settle in my chest like a fog. For years, Christmas morning had meant checking my phone for missed calls, waiting for invitations that never came, pretending not to care. This year, it meant silence, and that silence, for the first time, felt like peace, not punishment. The light filtered softly through the curtains, pale and gold against the frost-glazed windows. I pulled on a sweater and padded barefoot into the kitchen, where the fire from the night before had burned down to a glow. The house smelled faintly of pine and coffee, the quiet hum of the heater blending with the wind outside. Every detail, the warmth, the solitude, the view, reminded me that I wasn't missing out on anything anymore. I had simply traded noise for calm. As I sipped my coffee, I scrolled through the messages that had piled up overnight. Some were from family, still uncertain in tone, as if they were trying to feel out the boundaries of this new version of me. My mother had sent a longer one this time. I'm sorry for the years we forgot you. I didn't realize how much that hurt. You've built such a beautiful life. I'd love to see it someday. There was no defensiveness in her words, no excuses. Just sincerity, maybe even humility. For a while, I stared at the message, feeling a mixture of warmth and wariness. I wasn't sure yet what forgiveness looked like, not in practice. It wasn't as simple as replying, "It's okay." It was more like deciding what version of the relationship I was willing to carry forward and what weight I was ready to leave behind. I typed slowly, "Thank you. I'm not angry anymore, but I need things to be different if we start again." I stared at the message before hitting send. Boundaries, they used to scare me. I used to think they were walls, but now I understood they were doors with keys I could choose to turn or not. After breakfast, I bundled up and went outside. The snow reached almost to my knees, soft and untouched. The world around me looked like something out of a painting. The trees bowed with white, the sky an impossible blue, the valley below hidden under a blanket of light. I stood there, letting the cold sting my face, and for a long moment I just breathed. The air felt like renewal. Then, from down the path, I saw a familiar figure trudging up the hill. A puff of color against all that white Mags, wrapped in her enormous red scarf, carrying a thermos in one hand. "You didn't think I was letting you spend Christmas morning alone, did you?" she called out, her voice carrying in the quiet. I laughed as she reached the porch, stamping snow off her boots. "You're either the best friend or the nosiest neighbor I've ever had." "Both," she said with a grin. "I brought cocoa, and I figured it's time we celebrate your first holiday as the queen of the mountain. We sat together on the porch steps, sipping cocoa and watching the snow sparkle in the sun. She didn't pry about the dinner or the family or the messages. She just sat beside me, comfortable in the quiet, like she understood that peace didn't need conversation to be shared. After a while, she glanced over. "You look lighter," she said, "like you finally set something down." I nodded. Maybe I did. "What was it?" "The need to be chosen," I said simply. Mags smiled, her breath fogging in the air. "That's a big one to let go of." "Yeah," I said softly. "Turns out choosing yourself feels just as good." We sat in silence again after that, the only sound the soft creak of snow shifting under the sun. From somewhere down in the valley, a church bell rang, faint but clear, carried by the wind. It felt like a benediction, a quiet acknowledgement that something sacred had settled in the space where old hurt used to live. Later, after Mags left, I walked back inside and took the framed photograph of my mountain house, the same one I'd given to my family, and hung it by the front door. It wasn't about pride. It was a reminder of what it meant to reclaim your place in your own life, of how peace often looks less like victory and more like stillness. The day stretched long and calm. I read, I cooked a simple meal, I watched the sun set over the ridge. And when night came, the stars glittered so fiercely that the sky looked almost alive. I stood by the window, hand resting against the glass, and whispered a small, private prayer of gratitude, not for what I'd gained, but for what I'd finally released. For the first time in years, I didn't need to be invited anywhere. I was exactly where I was meant to be. The days that followed were strangely golden, stretched thin and quiet like the pause between heartbeats. I didn't realize how much space peace could take up until I stopped filling every silence with what-ifs. The mountain became my rhythm, the crunch of snow under boots in the morning, the sigh of wind against the windows at night. I woke early, built a fire, made coffee strong enough to taste like resolve. Every movement felt deliberate, grounded. On the second morning, I decided to go through some of the boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. They sat in the far corner of the living room, labeled in my own handwriting from months ago. Old stuff, memories, misc. I hadn't wanted to open them before, maybe because part of me feared the weight of what was inside, the remnants of all the times I'd tried to belong. But that morning, with sunlight spilling across the wooden floor, I felt ready. The first box held photo albums, yellowing at the edges. I flipped through pages of family gatherings, faces frozen in half-smiles. My own image appeared here and there, usually at the edge of the frame, slightly out of focus, as if even the camera hadn't been sure I was supposed to be there. Still, I found myself smiling. Those snapshots didn't hurt the way they used to. They were just proof that I had always shown up, even when no one noticed. At the bottom of the box was something I hadn't seen in years, a letter from my father, folded so many times the creases were soft. His handwriting was shaky but certain. "You can't force people to see your worth. You can only keep living like it's undeniable." I read it 3 times, the words sinking deeper with each pass. He'd written that when I was in college, after a fight with my mother about missing a family reunion. I hadn't understood it then. Now it felt like prophecy fulfilled. I placed the letter on the mantel, next to the photo of the cabin bathed in sunset light. The juxtaposition made me smile, his advice and my reality, side by side. The old world and the new one, both belonging to me. Around noon, I decided to take a walk. The air was cold enough to bite, but the kind of cold that wakes you up, sharp and clean. The forest path wound down toward a frozen creek, and the snow beneath the trees shimmered like crushed glass. Every so often, I'd stop and just listen to the sound of a woodpecker tapping somewhere far off, the whisper of snow sliding from branches. It was strange how alive quiet could feel once you stopped being afraid of it. Halfway down the trail, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my sister. "Mom wants to come visit next weekend. Just her. She says she wants to see the place." I stood there for a moment, phone in hand, breath clouding in the air. A month ago, that message would have filled me with anxiety, panic about whether I should say yes, fear of what it would mean if I didn't. But now it felt manageable, like a decision, not a test. I typed back, "Tell her she's welcome, but it'll be a short visit. I have boundaries here." I hit send before I could overthink it. The words were firm, but not cold. Kindness with edges, that was the balance I was learning to live by. When I got back home, I made soup and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The rhythm of the crackling logs reminded me of laughter, uneven human real, and I realized something important. My life didn't need to be flawless to be whole. It just needed to be mine. That evening, as the sky dimmed to violet and gold, I lit a single candle by the window. It wasn't for prayer or memory, it was for presence. A quiet acknowledgement that I was still here, still becoming. The mountain outside seemed to nod in agreement, the trees swaying slightly as if they understood. Later, before bed, I wrote in my journal, "I think peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the ability to choose your own company and find it enough." I paused, then added, "Even forgiveness starts there." As I closed the journal and turned off the lamp, I felt it, a subtle, profound shift. The story that had once been about exclusion was now becoming one of belonging. Not because anyone finally opened a door for me, but because I learned to build my own and to decide who I let through it. The following Saturday arrived with a hush, the kind of morning where the air felt heavy with something unspoken. I woke early, not out of anxiety but instinct, the same instinct that had once braced me for criticism, but now simply prepared me for clarity. The mountain was wrapped in a low mist, its usual view of pine and stone veiled in pale silver. I took that as a good omen. Sometimes, the world blurs before it sharpens again. By 10 o'clock, I'd made the house warm and quiet. A small pot of tea steamed on the counter, the scent of chamomile mingling with wood smoke. I wasn't trying to impress anyone, least of all my mother, but I wanted the space to reflect who I'd become. Calm, intentional, self-kept. When her car finally pulled up, I saw her through the window, stepping out slowly, wrapped in her heavy coat. She looked smaller than I remembered. It had been almost 2 years since we'd last spoken face to face, and in that time I'd built walls not out of stone or anger, but out of self-respect. Still, as I opened the door, I let warmth, not resentment, be the first thing she felt. "Hi, Mom," I said, my voice steady but soft. She smiled, but it trembled a little. "This place, it's beautiful." "Thank you," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "It's peaceful here." She looked around, eyes sweeping over the wooden beams, the quiet order of everything. There was a long silence before she finally said, "You've done well for yourself." For a moment, that old ache stirred, the one that used to crave her approval, but it didn't hurt the same way anymore. I just nodded. "I've tried to." We sat in the living room, the fire filling the gaps in our conversation. She complimented the house again, asked how I managed the purchase. Her tone wasn't suspicious, just curious, but I could hear the subtext. "When did you become capable of all this without us?" I poured tea and said, "I saved, I worked, I planned quietly." Then, because truth deserved air, I added, "I stopped waiting for anyone to include me before I started living." Her eyes lowered, the kind of glance that carries both shame and recognition. "We never meant to exclude you. You always seemed so busy, so distant." I didn't interrupt, but she stopped herself anyway. We both knew that wasn't the truth, at least not the full one. I had been distant, yes, but only after years of being treated like proximity was something I had to earn. "Mom," I said gently, "I'm not angry anymore. I was for a long time. But I understand now that people see what they want to see. And when they can't see you, sometimes you have to make peace with that instead of proving you exist." Her eyes softened then. Really softened, in a way I hadn't seen since childhood. "You sound like your father," she murmured. "I take that as a compliment," I said, smiling faintly. For a while we just sat there, two people separated by years of misunderstandings, now tethered again by something quieter and truer. She eventually took out a small envelope from her bag. "I brought you something," she said. Inside was a photo, an old one, creased and faded. Me, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting on my father's lap in front of the Christmas tree. My mother's handwriting on the back read, "Our best Christmas." "I found it while going through boxes," she said. "Thought you might want to keep it." I traced the edge of the photo with my thumb. "Thank you," I said and meant it. She looked around again, and for the first time she didn't just see the house. She saw me, the person who built it, brick by patient brick. "You really are happy here, aren't you?" "I am," I said, "but not because I'm alone, because I'm at peace with whoever chooses to stay and whoever doesn't." There was a long pause, and then she nodded slowly. "You've grown into someone I wish I'd known better." That caught me off guard, not because it was sentimental, but because it was honest. It wasn't an apology, not directly, but it was something truer. Maybe grace doesn't always sound like "I'm sorry." Sometimes it just sounds like recognition. As she stood to leave later that afternoon, I walked her to the door. The fog had lifted, sunlight glinted off the snow, making everything shine. She turned before stepping down the porch. "You'll come down for Christmas next year?" she asked, almost shyly. I smiled, holding her gaze. "Maybe, if it's an invitation, not an afterthought." Her lips parted as if to respond, but she just nodded. "You'll always have a place, you know." I looked back at the cabin, at the keys still resting on the entry table, gleaming faintly in the light. "I know," I said quietly. "I finally do." She drove away slowly, her car winding down the snowy path until it disappeared among the trees. I stood there for a long time after, listening to the fadding sound of her engine, feeling the kind of closure that doesn't slam shut but settles gently, like snow finding its place on the ground. Inside, the fire still burned low. I poured myself another cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the last traces of fog drift away. Maybe that's what forgiveness looks like, not the erasure of the past, but the courage to keep the door open just wide enough for change to enter, and no wider. That night, the mountain sky was unusually clear, ink black and scattered with stars that felt impossibly close, like you could reach out and stir them with your hand. I sat out on the porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, a mug of hot cocoa warming my fingers. The cabin behind me glowed softly through the windows, golden light flickering across the snow. It didn't feel like solitude anymore. It felt like sovereignty. The difference between being alone and being at peace had never been clearer. I thought about my mother's visit all evening. Her words lingered, but not in a heavy way. They echoed quietly, like a melody I could finally hear for what it was. There had been no grand apology, no sudden transformation, but maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe people didn't need to change in order for you to forgive them. Maybe forgiveness was simply reclaiming the part of yourself that used to ache for their approval and setting it free. I went inside and glanced again at the letter from my father still sitting on the mantel. The folded paper was a little worn now from how many times I'd read it. "You can't force people to see your worth. You can only keep living like it's undeniable." Those words had been a seed back then, buried deep in years of rejection. Now, standing here in the home I'd built from the quiet corners of that lesson, I could finally feel the roots of it holding me steady. There was a knock at the door, soft, almost hesitant. For a split second, my heart jumped. When I opened it, it wasn't anyone I expected. It was my cousin, Emma, the only one who'd ever reached out after the first few years of forgotten invitations. She stood there in her puffy jacket, cheeks red from the cold, a nervous smile tugging at her mouth. "Hey," she said, voice uncertain. "I hope it's okay I came up. Your mom mentioned you were here. I just wanted to see it." I stepped aside without hesitation. "Of course, come in." She looked around in quiet awe, running a hand along the wooden banister. "Wow, you really did it." "Yeah," I said, smiling. "Took a while, but I finally built something that feels like mine." We sat by the fire, and after a few minutes of small talk, she sighed. "You know, I used to ask them why they didn't invite you. They'd always say it must have been an accident or that you were busy. But I knew better. I just didn't know how to make it right." Her words were heavy with guilt, but I didn't want to let that be the tone of the night. "You don't need to make it right," I said gently. "You're here now, that's what matters." She nodded, eyes glistening slightly. "I'm sorry, though, you deserved better from all of us." I took a slow sip of cocoa before replying. "Maybe, but sometimes you need to lose the table you thought you belonged at to realize you were supposed to build your own." The fire popped softly, a glowing ember jumping against the screen. For a long while, we just sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists when both people have nothing left to prove. Eventually, Emma smiled. You know, maybe next year we could have Christmas here. Just you, me, maybe your mom if she's brave enough to face this drive again. I laughed. That's a steep road for redemption. Worth it, though, she said, grinning. I looked at her then, really looked. There was something about her presence that felt like the final stitch in a long unfinished seam. The kind of small, sincere act that doesn't rewrite the past but softens it. When she left later that night, I walked her out to her car. The moon had climbed high, throwing silver light across the snow-covered trees. Before she got in, she turned to me and said, "You know, I think Uncle Mark would have loved it up here. He always said you had the same kind of quiet backbone he did." The words caught me off guard. "Yeah," I said, smiling faintly. "He'd probably tease me for not chopping my own wood, though." We both laughed softly, and as her headlights disappeared down the mountain road, I felt something shift, subtle but real. The circle wasn't complete, but it was widening, mending in quiet, human ways. Back inside, I stood in front of the fireplace again. The house was still warm, still breathing in its slow rhythm. On the counter, 3 identical keys still lay in their wooden box. For months, they'd just been symbols, proof of independence, of freedom. But tonight, I picked up one and turned it between my fingers. Maybe it was time to let one of them mean something more. I placed the key in a small envelope and wrote a note. For whoever remembers to show up next year, this door will be open, once. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a promise. It was balance, grace with conditions. I wasn't closing the door, but I was no longer the one waiting on the other side of it, hopping to be seen. When I finally went to bed, the stars outside were brighter than ever, scattered like 1,000 small proofs against the dark. I lay there with the window cracked just enough to let in the sound of wind in the trees, feeling something I hadn't known how to name for a long time. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even triumph. It was peace, quiet, earned, and entirely my own. The morning after Emma's visit came soft and slow, wrapped in the hush that only snow can make. I woke to the faint light of dawn filtering through the curtains, the kind of light that feels like forgiveness before you even open your eyes. For a few moments, I just lay there, listening to the quiet creaks of the cabin as it settled with the cold, the comforting rhythm of something alive, but at ease. It struck me how long it had been since I started a day without the weight of expectation. No need to perform, no one waiting to measure how much space I was allowed to take up. Just me and the sound of my own breathing. I made coffee and stepped outside, mug steaming against the sharp morning air. The mountains stretched out beneath a pale sky, the world glazed in a fresh layer of snow that sparkled like untouched truth. I stood there barefoot on the porch for a while, my toes biting at the cold, my heart steady. This house, this view, this peace, they were never about showing anyone what I could do. They were about reminding myself that I didn't need to be chosen to matter. Inside, the photo from my mother still rested on the mantel, the one she'd given me our best Christmas. I looked at it differently now, not as a snapshot of something lost, but as proof that even then, love had existed, imperfect and clumsy, but real. People forget, they fail, they falter. But somewhere in those cracks, something soft can still grow. I sat at the table by the big window, notebook open, pen in hand. It had become my ritual since moving here to write one honest page every Sunday. Today's words came easy, like they'd been waiting at the edge of my chest. Every year they forgot to invite me, I thought I was the problem. That if I'd been more agreeable, more forgiving, more convenient, maybe I'd still have a chair at their table. But I see now, I wasn't meant to be at a table where my silence was the price of entry. So I built my own. And if they come one day, they'll find there's room, but not the same rules. I don't need apologies anymore, just presence. And presence must be earned. I set down the pen, exhaled, and smiled. Writing it didn't make me feel bitter. It made me feel clear. Boundaries weren't walls, they were gates with locks you controlled. And I finally understood that holding the key didn't make you cold, it made you safe. Later that afternoon, I bundled up and took one last walk through the pines before the year ended. The forest was still and bright, sunlight threading through the branches like gold ribbon. Every sound, the crunch of snow beneath my boots, the distant caw of a bird, felt amplified, like the world was reminding me that even in stillness, life moves. As I walked, I found myself thinking about next Christmas, not with dread, but curiosity. Maybe there'd be new traditions. Maybe there'd be laughter in this cabin again, the kind that didn't depend on approval but connection. Maybe the people who once forgot would remember, not because they missed me, but because they finally saw the kind of peace that couldn't be bought or faked. When I returned home, the sun was setting behind the mountain, the sky a slow burn of orange and lavender. I poured a glass of wine and stood by the window as the first lights of the valley flickered on below. Somewhere out there, they were probably gathered around their table again, the same jokes, the same patterns, the same omissions. But it no longer felt like I was on the outside looking in. It felt like I'd stepped into my own chapter while theirs kept looping where it was meant to. I reached for the envelope I'd left on the counter, the one with the spare key and the note inside. It sat there, quiet, patient, waiting for the future to do what it would. I smiled to myself and whispered, "It's enough to know the door, here." When I turned off the lights and let the fire dim, the stars were already scattering across the sky. I stood there one last time at the window, watching their shimmer ripple through the dark glass. And in that reflection, I didn't see the person who used to wait for an invitation that never came. I saw someone who'd built a home inside their own peace and finally, truly, arrived. And as I whispered a soft good night to the mountains, to the quiet, to every version of myself that had waited and hurt and hoped, I realized the story wasn't about being forgotten anymore. It was about remembering myself first.